Okay, let's get started. So again, welcome to everyone for joining the webinar today. The title of today's webinar is Emerging Technologies and Infrastructure for Monitoring Bats and Birds in the Offshore Environment. On behalf of the SEER group, I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And let's see. So the plan for today is I'll give a brief overview of SEER, introduce our presenters, and they'll present one after another, and then we'll save questions for the very end. And you are welcome to enter your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. And then one last slide for me to close out the webinar at the very end. So SEER is an acronym for the Synthesis of Environmental Effects Research for U.S. offshore wind energy, and it was under the direction of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Technologies Office. For the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to jointly lead this multi-year collaboration to share information on the environmental effects of offshore wind to help prioritize future needs. And so what this project has done is synthesize and disseminate information using whatever information we have from the US, from the international community, to understand the environmental effects, monitoring tools and mitigation strategies for offshore wind, and how it can apply to the U.S. offshore wind deployment. We also identify the knowledge and research gaps and collaborate with regional experts and existing science entities and collaboratives to fully leverage all the expertise and information that's out there. So SEER has in the last couple of years produced several research briefs on the state of the knowledge on stressor receptor interactions and monitoring methods and technologies, mitigation measures, and cumulative impacts. And based off those briefs, we held an original 4-part webinar series. And then we've also worked to summarize information gaps, barriers, current challenges for the U.S. Atlantic and Pacific coasts. And all this information can be found with the QR code there in the upper right and the website listed here below. Okay, enough of the introductory materials. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We have 3 well-experienced, fantastic people to talk about different technologies that are used for monitoring birds and bats in the offshore environment. We'll start with Greg Forcey, who is a senior principal scientist at Normandeau Associates, followed by Robb Diehl, who is a research ecologist at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center with the U.S. Geological Survey. And our last presenter is Kate Williams, director of the Center for Research on Offshore Wind and the Environment, and she's from the Biodiversity Research Institute. So Greg, you're up first. I will stop sharing my screen and you're welcome to share your slides whenever you're ready.
Everything look good? Can you see it?
Yep, that's perfect.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the emerging technologies that's available for collecting bird and bat interaction data at wind turbines in the offshore environment called ATOM. And I'll go over a bit about the background of ATOM, why it's important, what it's useful for, and what some of its limitations are. So the United States has a goal of developing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And there are several different regulatory drivers that are stressing the importance of minimizing our impacts to birds and bats, including the NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And the main concerns from offshore wind development on birds and bats are mortality from collisions, and then those are direct effects, and then indirect impacts on population fitness through either displacement or attraction. So avoidance studies of seabirds, there's been a lot of research that's been looked at avoidance and displacement in Europe. And typically when these studies are done, they characterize avoidance or displacement in three different spatial scales: macro avoidance, which is avoidance of the wind farm entirely. Meso avoidance is navigating through the wind facility, but avoiding individual turbines. And then micro avoidance is avoiding the blades when you're in proximity, when a bird or bat is in proximity to a turbine. This has largely been understudied in terrestrial environments, and micro avoidance in general, even in the offshore environment, has been understudied as well. So one way we can get more information on this is to use technology, and ATOM is one way, one technology that's available to help us better understand micro avoidance. So conceptually, ATOM is a series of 4 different sensor types that are installed on the turbine platform and aimed at the rotor swept zone. So we have acoustic, audible, and ultrasound detectors for birds and bats, VHF receivers, which detect Modis tag birds as they pass within proximity to the turbine. And then we have thermal stereo videography, as well as visible light videography. So what does this look like on the turbine platform? So the picture on the left shows the main ATOM box with the thermal and visible light video cameras, along with the washer fluid to clean the lenses on the cameras, as well as a drive array. And this system is installed on a chassis and then anchored to the turbine platform to address any kind of extreme weather conditions that might happen there, and probably will. Then the middle picture shows the 2 bird and 2 bat acoustic detectors and the microphones associated with those detectors. And then on the picture, the second picture in the middle on the left shows one of the 2 Modis antennas, 2 Yagi antennas, and then 1 Omni antenna that's parallel to the pole. And the picture on the right shows another a set of 2 Yagi and 1 Omni antennas located away from the other antenna to minimize interference from the monopole. So talking a little bit more about the sensors in general. So the thermal cameras are 2 cameras that are in that weatherproof box. We're using 2 cameras so that the cameras operate in stereo, and this permits us to calculate flight height, flight speed, and flight direction of targets as they pass through the rotor swept zone. Thermal imaging also gives us the capability to detect targets in poor conditions. And this is particularly important since poor conditions frequently occur in the offshore environment. So the one limitation of thermal imagery is that it's difficult to get species identifications. And I have that particular bullet point with an asterisk because in the cases of when birds have very distinct silhouettes, we can actually get species ID, but that is not the case most of the time. So one way to address the limitations of thermal is to add another type of sensor. So, and that is visible light cameras. So this is a single camera that we have that's installed inside a weatherproof housing. And this gives us additional information that the thermal camera does not, primarily in the form of species identifications that are just difficult to get with thermal. So the limitations of one sensor can be addressed by the advantages of another sensor and vice versa. Then moving forward again with the third sensor type that's part of ATOM are the acoustics. So, and typically on our installs, we use 2 bird detectors and 2 bat detectors. They're generally aimed at the same airspace. We just using 2 for redundancy in case there's an issue with one of them. These are also housed inside weatherproof containers. And these sensor types do allow us to get species identifications. Although it's very difficult to determine the number of individuals from these data. And then finally, the fourth sensor type is Modis, and typically on these types of installs, we use a single dual band CTT receiver along with 4 Yagi antennas in a split mast design. I mentioned the split mast design in an earlier slide. So that's just with the split mast as opposed to the full mast. A full mast would contain 4 Yagi antennas. The split mast just contains 2 plus an Omni. And that allows us to position the antennas in different locations on the platform to address any kind of interference that would be caused by the presence of the monopole. So in addition to the 4 Yagis, we have the 2 Omnis. And then we use 2 different configurations. One configuration where we have our Yagi antennas tuned to 166 megahertz and the Omnis tuned to 434 megahertz. And then the other configuration is the opposite. And this is just to maximize detection range of the 2 frequency bands that are used by the Modis network. And I think Kate's going to talk more about that in her talk later this afternoon. So these data, the data from Modis give us detections of tags, and we're able to get a sense of species occurrence and proximity to the turbines. So talking a little bit more about the types of data that we can get from ATOM, I'm going to present some of the results from our first year of data collection at the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project. This is a 2-turbine, 12 megawatt demonstration project about 23 miles off the coast of Virginia. And during the first year of monitoring, we collected data in 3 different seasonal periods and processed the data on our servers here in Gainesville. And I'm going to present some of the results from that. So we had, from the first year, we had 1,581 detections. We had 1,011 birds and 521 bats. 99% of those detections occurred during the fall. And most of the detections were birds, including a variety of shorebird, gull, tern, raptor, woodpecker, and migrant passerine species. We were also able to find skuas, corvids, and swallows, but we weren't able to ascribe any of those detections to an individual species. So looking at some of the activity data, we had about 90% of bird activity observed during the day, but we also had about 45% of bat detections observed during the day, which was a bit unexpected. And then we looked at relationships with activity and different weather variables. So we saw that bat activity is most often occurring between 20 and 24 degrees Celsius, whereas bird activity is mostly occurring between 19 and 22 degrees Celsius. So we weren't, as most of these detections occurred in the fall, we weren't sampling the wide range of temperatures that would have been present with the summer and the winter. But still, these are really narrow temperature ranges that we found when most of the activity occurred. And then expanding the birds out to look at passerines only on the left and non-passerines on the right, we see the relationship still holds looking at those different species groups. Then now looking at comparing bird and bat activity in relation to wind speed. So for bats, we observed activity out to 16 meters per second, but activity declining above 6 meters per second. And so there's mostly no activity at all above 10 meters per second. And then for birds, we saw a sharp decline in activity above 5 meters per second and minimal activity above 8 meters per second. And again, we're looking at just passerines on the left and non-passerines on the right. We do see the decline in both. The decline in non-passerines, though, is less dramatic. as well as we recorded activity of non-passerines out to 14 meters per second as compared to only 12 meters per second for passerines. And these data are interesting because the turbine cut-in speeds are typically between 3 meters per second and 5 meters per second. So in the case of bats and especially birds, much of the activity that we're seeing is occurring underneath the cut-in speed, which blades would normally be spinning, which has implications for collision risk. So now extending this beyond weather relationships and looking at the blade activity, we saw 72% of the bird activity occurring when the blades were not moving. However, 55% bat activity occurred when the blades were moving. So, and the blades were moving approximately 81% of the time. So this finding suggests that collision risk will be lower than if we just consider just looking at the activity data alone. Then looking further at the behavior. So we had about 1/3 of all the detections involved foraging behavior in some way. So, and we noted foraging behavior by 21 bird and 2 bat species or species groups. We noted aerial foraging, hawking, and monopole gleaning throughout the study period. And all of the foraging behavior that we saw was associated with insects, except foraging by peregrine falcons. And then looking at the microavoidance that I touched on earlier in the presentation, we had 70 observations of microavoidance from 18 species or species groups. We also noted 2 air displacements, 1 bird and 1 bat. And an air displacement is just when the animal got disturbed by the air currents in the blade and seemed to have lost course and then flown away or dropped down and then eventually regained its footing and flew off. And we did not see any collisions during the first year of the study. And the 3 pictures on the bottom give you a sense of the different types of microavoidance that we saw. We saw changes in direction or changes in speed, like in the center figure, or no adjustment at all. And just the bird or bat is flying directly through the blades. So the applications of these data, could be useful for informing collision risk models or curtailment regimes. They could be useful for understanding what species are occurring in the area and be useful for prioritizing those species for future research. And they can be used to guide minimization and mitigation strategies. So the next phase research trials that we're going to be looking at doing to expand the capabilities of ATOM, we're looking at expanding the coverage so that we can get 360-degree coverage around the turbine and the monopole. So this has been of interest for some developers. So we're working on prioritizing adding this feature. We're also looking at increasing the detection range with nacelle mounted equipment, since our detection range does decline as distance increases from the ATOM system to the target increases. So we're looking at improving that with the idea of nacelle mounted equipment. And then finally, we're looking at adding in smart curtailment integration. This would be using the data collected by ATOM to inform curtailment of turbines only when animals are present. And this is a natural extension of the timer smart curtailment technology that we use on terrestrial wind facilities. We thank several different institutions for all their help in making this research possible, Dominion and the CVAL project for supporting and funding, SGRE for coordinating site visits, and Fast Ferry for getting us out and back to the turbines, and then BOEM for also supporting the initial development of the first ATOM system. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Rob, whenever you're ready to share your slides, feel free.
All right. Thank you. Can people see this?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Chris. I'm going to talk today with you about radar-based biological monitoring and how that applies in offshore environments. Get a little bit into the methods and talk some about forthcoming research, but a little bit of background, and all three of us will probably say some varying version of how we need to learn more about potential collision and displacement hazards posed to birds and bats in offshore settings. Some of our projects are a little more prospective projects, are a little more focused on songbirds. They've received, in some cases, less attention than other taxa in offshore wind-related studies. And then, of course, gathering data in relation to how varying types of behaviors related to phenology, distribution, altitude, abundance, and so on and so forth vary with conditions. So that's sort of the general, almost boilerplate biological background that applies to all this work. The challenge remains that these are offshore environments that are just really challenging places to study, even onshore, which is my research domain. Understanding how animals use the airspace poses really challenging problems for remote sensing. Pre-construction data collection, in particular, at the lease area, at the call area, is constrained by the fact that we're dealing with unforgiving environments. You know, Greg was sort of alluding to this. Platforms are few or do not exist at all for the deployment of remote sensing technology. And even when they do, budgetary constraints require that equipment be extremely robust operationally so as to limit maintenance and repair cycles. So the upshot is we have the severe biological need owing to offshore wind energy development, and we are continuously faced with the challenges of gathering the necessary baseline pre and post construction data associated with these environments. So I'm going to just jump in here a little bit and talk about something that I'm actually not going to talk about much, and that is NEXRAD radar, and consider a little bit the scales of radar observation when it comes to the offshore setting. NEXRAD is our system of weather radars. There are approximately 160 NEXRAD units scattered across the country. They are strictly terrestrial, but their range of operation is such that in coastal settings they do reach out over open water and can provide some data on what's happening in the airspaces over open water. However, owing to a combination of factors, the distance from shore that they are often located, the height even of the pedestal on which these radars are sitting, and the fact that the radar beam curves out from beneath the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, means that by the time the radar beam passes over open water, it's usually even the lower edge of the beam, which is what we're seeing here in the lower figure, is considerably above the sea surface, such that only a small portion of the rotor swept zone is directly covered. And in the case here of the Lake Charles radar, you know, it stands about 39 kilometers from the nearest shoreline. And so by that point, the radar beam has already, even the lowest edge of the radar beam has already is already well above the ground, such that it only really, once it moves offshore, has the chance of clipping the upper edge of the rotor swept zone. So it's not to say that these data don't have value. They do. And it might be down the road that once we combine observations with NEXRAD NEXRAD-based observations of animals moving in offshore environments with other kinds of remotely sensed and direct observation data, that observations from NEXRAD can index activity of what might be happening beneath its beam. and do so relatively inexpensively owing to the ready availability of these data. But just to give a sense of scale, and this is from some terrestrial work that I've done, but the portable radars that we'll be talking about mostly today sample just a tiny fraction of the airspace that NexRad does. And unlike NexRad, portable units tend to detect individual flying animals, whereas NexRad radars tend to aggregate those targets into volumes of airspace that are themselves then quantified. So they really do, these two kinds of commonly used instrumentation operate at very different spatial scales, and as a byproduct of that, reveal different kinds of and complementary information about biological movements generally. So this is where I've worked over the years with our portable radar units, and you'll notice, apropos of this particular discussion, that none of these red dots actually appears over open water. So that's this offshore work is a relatively new area for me. I understand the instrumentation quite well, but we are now faced with a number of offshore projects here, seen in yellow, have some onshore ones too, where we're going to be deploying portable radar units for the purposes already discussed. And so I'll briefly touch on 3 of those projects here, but I wanted to get into a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of portable radars for offshore settings. Starting with the advantages, these measurements occur at the location of interest. And so the goal is to try to deploy this instrumentation in places where developments will actually occur. This is a drawback of some telemetry-based approaches. You know, we might tag a variety of animals in the hope that they transit areas that are slated for development, but we never actually know. I don't view this as a negative. Rather, it's an instance where we have complementary data sets providing a more complete picture of the biology. Radars provide relatively comprehensive coverage of their airspaces. In the case of portable radar, what that airspace looks like, it depends on how the instrumentation is assembled, but generally speaking, we can detect insects out to, depending on the antenna, maybe 2 to 4 kilometers from the radar itself. So quite sensitive. I would call these sort of mesoscale units in terms of their scale of operation. They operate continuously and are not concerned with the amount of light in the sky. We already mentioned range of detection, wide range of animal sizes, like I said, everything down to a medium-sized insect. And in terms of behavior, probably referring to the macro, meso, micro scale avoidance behaviors that Greg has already mentioned. These data have been shown to be useful for detecting avoidance at macro and meso scales. On the disadvantages side, the major exclamation point is course identification of flying animals. I'll get into that a little bit, but it is probably the major drawback. So in some respects, radar is good as an indexing technology, but if there is a species-specific concern, it tends not to be a favored instrument or favored remote sensing method, unless the local natural history is such that we can really very much narrow down what the likelihood of observed targets, radar targets are. It's technically complex, as are all the technologies that will be considered today. We do need access to power. That's a limitation. We do have to have some kind of structure for placement. That's a limitation. And birds on the sea surface, with some possible exception, or flying at very low, those challenges to detection. So those would be some disadvantages. This is a radar instrument akin to what we're advancing for offshore deployment here on the right. Some of the capabilities that we are pursuing in numerous projects include platform stabilization, and so this would be for deployment on buoys and boats. If there are questions to this effect, we can get into the weeds on that, but I don't have time to do that here. Again, target discrimination. Radars tend to come in two broad flavors, X-band and S-band. This refers to the wavelength of the radar itself. S-band is sometimes favored because they tend to kind of by default filter out small targets like insects, but they also have the disadvantage of filtering out sometimes small vertebrates that are maybe the focus of our conservation interest. Moreover, insects, while they might be considered noise in some respects, they're also food, as Greg was documenting. And for that reason, knowledge of insect presence in these areas is important. So we are favoring X-band radars for this purpose, and that faces us with the need to discriminate insects from vertebrates and, to the extent possible, vertebrates from each other. We tend to do that with wing beat rate, supported by machine learning. There are some methodological issues that have created some incompatibilities with that approach to target discrimination, and at the same time gathering data on speed and direction of targets. And I'll briefly get into how we try to get past that. Sea clutter mitigation is a problem. We'll be addressing that with antenna design and some signal processing. We're advancing these radars toward being more software oriented. Software control of antenna position will be a major advance, and so we are replacing the motors inside these units and adding motors to the outsides of them to gain this control, which makes them, and they're highly customizable in how they sample the airspace. They could be remotely programmed to do that, adapt to changing conditions. And because we're using off-the-shelf radars, coupled with a sort of a more software-based approach to control, their capability per dollar should grow considerably as the outcome of some of these projects. And finally, there may be non-biological applications in terms of weather monitoring and such, and we'll just have to see how that sort of plays out. A brief delve into methodology here. When the radar beam is not rotating, which is a real common mode for radar data collection, off the shelf, these radars rotate about 24 RPM, although there are variations on that, and speeds and directions are stitched together from those data. However, we aren't able to get information on a wing beat pattern or really good information on, or better information on target discrimination unless the beam is not rotating. So what we're going to be doing is advancing more fixed beam sampling approaches into offshore monitoring to advance target discrimination. And in doing that, this is a couple examples of wing beat patterns. So here's a single flap coasting songbird. It's a real typical pattern for small songbirds. In this case, in this frequency spectrogram, you can see we have about 20 hertz is the dominant frequency here with some harmonics. This is what a couple insects looks like also in the radar beam. They're beating their wings considerably faster. If we were to look at this in a traditional mode, a rotating radar with blips on a screen, these two insects are so close to one another that they would be undistinguishable. They would be one blip, if you will, on the radar. But because they beat their wings at different rates, and we're analyzing using Fourier transform, pretty common signal processing techniques, we can actually distinguish two targets occurring in the same airspace in the frequency domain. So there are some advances here to getting better counts of animal presence in the airspace. By combining data gathered at different radials, fixed beam radials, we can bring them together, and I'm not going to go in the weeds here, to actually recover speed, direction, and what I call convergence, divergence, but something on the nature of the broader movement that's happening. And so the sampling strategies that we're advancing actually enable us to get information on speed and direction of the population while having information on the target discrimination, on the target type that we'll be looking at. So some of the projects we have forthcoming in a couple months, 6 weeks actually, we'll be putting a biological radar on this ship, the Gordon Gunther, which does benthic surveys at each of these sort of point locations seen in the map here. Mostly during September. And so this will be, it's more sort of a pilot project in a way, but we'll be doing some broad aerial surveys of the airspace as this as the Gunter goes through its benthic surveys. We'll be deploying 5 of these units on oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico in spring of 2024. We have some tentative sites located, but we'll have to see what our agreements with developers looks like to see where the final locations for these for this instrumentation actually lands. And then in a more thoroughly research and development project, we're advancing buoy deployable biological radar. So it's a system to detect flying animals over open water, suitable for deployment on any floating platform, really. It's a greater than 5-year project horizon that includes the research and development time frame, which we're in the midst of now, field validation, which will be starting in a few months, and the early baseline data collection from this system is slated for somewhere in the Great Lakes that is to be determined. So broad goals are, as we sort of already discussed, are kind of the same as what a lot of these projects and initiatives involve learning something about the distribution with a focus on songbirds for some of these projects. The horizontal distribution, vertical distribution, stratification, densities, how these abundances change over time and how they vary with conditions. But in the process, we'll be advancing radar methodology considerably, exploring efficacy of shifts of opportunity and how those data can relate to other project work, evaluating the efficacy of stabilization from a quality control standpoint. The presence of insects are often viewed as contamination from a vertebrate biologist point of view. I don't view it that way myself, but their presence has implications for how we sample and for the biology. Seed clutter mitigation, how we deal with that, and then exploring sampling strategies and which ones are optimal to advancing our biological goals. So that's all I have. I'll just want to, sorry for going over a little bit, but I want to thank folks listed here, and when the time comes, I'll take questions.
Thanks, Rob. And Kate, when you're ready to share your slides, go for it.
How does that look?
Perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm Kate Williams. I'm the director of the Center for Research on Offshore Wind and the Environment at the Biodiversity Research Institute. And I'm going to be talking some more. You already heard a little bit from Greg already about MODIS, automated radio telemetry tracking. And I'll be touching on that as well as a little bit of other types of tracking. So I want to start off by just acknowledging that I'm going to be touching on multiple collaborative projects today that we've been involved with in recent years. So I want to acknowledge up front that, some of what I'm going to be talking about had multiple funding sources, and there were a wide range of people involved in some of these discussions, including folks at BRI, but also Fish and Wildlife Service, Birds Canada, and elsewhere. So real briefly, I'm going to talk a little generally about biotelemetry and offshore wind development, and then go into automated radio telemetry, or MODIS, and then think a little bit about sort of potential research and development needs based on limitations of existing technologies. So biotelemetry is systems deployed on animals in order to measure their movements or other aspects of their behavior or physiology. And there's a lot of different types of biotelemetry technology. I'm not going to touch on most of these today. I'll just focus on one or two that are pretty commonly being deployed in relation to offshore wind development. And biotelemetry, these different types of tracking methods can be really helpful for understanding risks and effects of offshore wind development on aerofauna, so birds and bats. They can help inform understanding of collision risk, changes in habitat use, so things like displacement and attraction at a range of spatial scales. You can get data from all times of day and all weather conditions, which isn't true for a lot of other types of monitoring systems. You can get data that's species specific and age and sex specific, which can be really important for understanding risk to specific species or subpopulations. And because you're capturing the animals to deploy the tags, it also allows for collection of ancillary data. So for example, tissue sampling to understand physiological parameters. So this is a quick summary of 3 common types of biotelemetry in relation to offshore wind. So GPS/GSM transmitters, satellite transmitters, and automated radio transmitters. They all, mostly allow for remote transfer of data, though not always. And for most of them, there's a real trade-off between the resolution of data that you can get and battery life. And that's due to weight limitations. So you don't want to burden animals with too heavy a transmitter, and the majority of that weight comes from battery. So that really limits how much data and what resolution of data you can collect. So some tags do have solar panels that allow for additional data collection, but often there is a limit in terms of the total number of locations that tags can collect while maintaining that sort of safe weight of the tag relative to the size of the bird or bat that you're deploying it on. So GPS tags can provide very high resolution data. In some cases, you can get flight speed, flight height, other details on movements, as well as very precise location information. So within a couple of meters, location fixes. But as I was just talking about, the tags are relatively heavy, and that can really severely limit their use for a lot of taxa. Argos satellite tags, they have some similar limitations to GPS. They also have less accurate spatial information than GPS tags. You can't get reliable flight height information from satellite tags. But there are certain species where they actually are the best approach because of issues with tolerating different types of tag attachments. And then lastly, digital VHF or automated radio telemetry or Modis. You'll hear me probably using any of those 3 sort of interchangeably. The radio tags are very lightweight. They're very small. They can transmit every 5 to 10 seconds, so you get really high temporal resolution, but they do require a network of receivers to detect them. So the tags aren't actually transmitting data to satellites or via the cell network. And they don't actually provide location data on the animal per se. It's more or less like this tag was detected within the range of this receiving station. So in general, it tends to be a little bit better for sort of presence absence data in the range of tracking towers. Modis can be really good for sort of looking at regional movements where there's sufficient tower coverage. So it has some limitations, but it is really the only suitable option for species that are way less than about 50 grams, which is like a lot of songbirds and bats. There are currently, offshore wind related research projects using all 3 of those tracking technologies. But if you want to study those smaller bodied species, you really can't use GPS or satellite tags in most cases. And Modis tags are so small, like less than 3 grams, that you can put them on most songbirds and some bats. And in the US Atlantic, there are a couple of species in particular that fall species of interest that sort of fall into this size category, including several species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, like the roseate tern, piping plover, and the Rufa red knot. And additionally, you do need these receiving stations to detect tags, but there actually is an international collaborative network of existing stations, the Modis Wildlife Tracking System, which is operated by Birds Canada. So the Modis Wildlife Tracking System manages and stores all the automated radio telemetry data on the network. I think the stats on this page are dated at this point, but it's quite a large collaboration. And any animal that is tagged on this network can be detected on any station within the network. assuming it's set up to detect that tag frequency. As Greg mentioned, there are actually two frequencies that MODIS operates on, 166 megahertz and 434 megahertz. So it's a very powerful sort of collaboration that actually crosses continents. And just a real quick primer on how it actually works, if anyone's unfamiliar with it. So you attach the tag to a bird. In this case, you can see a nano tag attached to the back of a black-throated blue warbler. The tag transmits a uniquely identifiable signal that's unique to that particular tag, but they're all transmitting those signals on a shared frequency. So the antennas can all be on that same frequency. And they're, again, very lightweight. So a black-throated blue warbler weighs about the same as a couple of pennies. And so the tag needs to be way lighter than that. And MODIS tags can get down to that size. And then you have the receiving station. So for those, and Greg showed a great example earlier, actually on a turbine platform, but in general, you have antennas that are elevated on a mast or some other type of structure. Those will receive the signals from the tagged animals. The station in this picture actually has 8 antennas. So it has one omnidirectional antenna, which is the whip antenna on top, and then it has 7 Yagi, sort of Yagi-Udon directional antennas. And that's because this station is just set up to detect tags at both frequencies. So we've got Yagi antennas for both frequencies on there. And incidentally, just because Yagi antennas do have this directional detection capability, the detection range of a typical MODIS station with both Omnis and Yagis, like this sort of recommended setup, it isn't, the detection range isn't a simple circle around the station. It's actually sort of shaped more like a 3D flower almost, with like these petals extending along the directions of the Yagi antennas. So it's, and I'll get into this more later, but it actually is really important to try and understand what that detection range and the shape of that detection range is for individual stations that may have different setups, different numbers of antennas, that kind of thing. So you have the antennas, they're attached via coax cables to a receiving station in a receiving unit. In this picture, that's down in a box on the ground. And that is a data logger that records the tag birds of bats flying by. So that's recording that tag ID, the timestamp, the ID of the antenna that detected the tag, and then a signal strength value. And then lastly, you need a continuous power source for the receiving station. So researchers have begun to use automated telemetry to determine occupancy and flight paths for marine birds in relation to offshore wind quite a bit in recent years. In the US, a lot of this work has been coming from Pam Loring and her collaborators. Telemetry receivers have historically really been placed mostly on sort of coastal and inland locations, but stations are now located on multiple offshore turbines and buoys in the US Atlantic, and we're going to be seeing more of those. And so there's really an opportunity with offshore wind build out to have new platforms in these offshore environments where there wasn't previously a platform to put these receiving stations, to really be able to better understand offshore presence and movements for some of these smaller bodied bird and bat species. And I think I touched on this briefly already, but automated telemetry can be really helpful for sort of larger scale questions. So thinking about occupancy, thinking about macro scale avoidance. With some additional R&D and some careful study design, we might be able to get to the point where we can better approximate 3-dimensional locations of animals from MODIS telemetry. There's some ongoing work at the University of Rhode Island to try to get at this, try and get more accurate flight paths and flight heights. And we might be able to get to sort of mesoscale avoidance and attraction behavior with MODIS with continued development. It's never going to be the right technology to examine really fine scale questions like trying to detect collisions or micro avoidance. But MODIS actually can provide really useful information to parameterize collision risk models. So just as an example, there is a collision risk model that was developed using MODIS data for 3 ESA listed bird species that's in final review with BOEM now. So a few years ago, so I guess first I want to just briefly say, how effective is MODIS for answering key questions for marine species? And it really depends on the goal of the study, on the design of the study, the transmitter configuration, the receiving station configuration, the study species, how species move through the environment. Like Rob was saying with radar, birds right on the water surface. MODIS isn't great for detecting those. If birds spend a lot of time on the wing, it tends to work a lot better. There's some nuances like that for developing an effective MODIS study. So a couple of years ago, NYSERDA funded a project that was led by Pam Loring at Fish and Wildlife Service and partners to really try and develop standardized protocols for using automated radio telemetry to monitor bird and bat movements at offshore wind energy areas throughout the US Atlantic. So these protocols are fully published, they're public on the MODIS website, and they're what we're sort of pointing people towards who are thinking about deploying MODIS stations on offshore infrastructure or in relation to offshore wind development generally. There were 5 main end products that inform coordination and study design and deployment of offshore MODIS stations and transmitters. So that they include a monitoring framework, which is really an overview to help guide tagging efforts and study design for offshore MODIS projects generally. There's a guidance document that's focused on really deploying MODIS stations offshore on buoys and on turbine platforms. There's an online study design tool called Idioms that allows users to map detection coverage for prospective stations and help try and figure out where to put stations within a wind farm and sort of maximize their coverage. There's a simulation study to model animal movement data through offshore arrays and better understand detection issues that fed into the study design tool. And then lastly, we developed a MODIS data framework, and that includes a centralized portal on the MODIS website for MODIS stations and transmitters that are deployed in relation to offshore wind development in the Atlantic. So I'm not going to get into all of these in detail, but just as an example, the guidance document includes technical specifications for deploying these offshore receiving stations on turbine platforms and on buoys. So it gets into, optimal configuration of equipment. And Greg actually showed an excellent example of what an offshore MODIS station on a turbine platform can look like. It also gets into things like best practices to optimize detection range and data quality, maintenance and calibration of equipment. As I noted, when you set up a new station, you really need to try to assess the detection range of it so you understand what the area is that you're able to detect tags within. And there's also some minimum sort of data processing and delivery standards for receiving stations. And the study design tool is online. Anyone can play around with it, see how it helps to inform the design and placement of offshore MODIS stations at wind farms. There is a default sort of hypothetical wind project that you can use to explore the tool, or you can actually upload your own turbine locations. So next steps for automated radio telemetry and offshore wind. We're going to see continued expansion of the network into offshore locations, hopefully following existing guidance and actually updating our guidance as needed as the process sort of goes along. We do, as I mentioned, need some continued R&D, and there is an ongoing project funded by the Department of Energy and BOEM to try to develop models to estimate 3-dimensional locations from MODIS detections. We're going to start seeing a lot more, as Greg showed at CVAL, a lot more use of MODIS technology actually at operational wind farms. to study things like occupancy and macro avoidance. That's just starting to happen both in the US and in Europe, but there's going to be a lot of interesting studies coming down the pike. And one last thing I guess I would note is that given the scale of expansion into the offshore environment, it's starting to feel like there's a real need for additional coordination of both tagging and station deployment locations at a really sort of coast-wide scale to try and make sure we're maximizing coverage, avoiding duplication of effort. And this is something we've been talking about through the guidance development project, and maybe as a potential role, it's been discussed for the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative at a future date. Real briefly, I want to just touch on other needs to further develop and apply biotelemetry technologies other than Modis in relation to offshore wind. We have a study funded by NOWRDC that ends this September, and we're focused on identifying limitations of available technologies for monitoring birds and marine mammals, actually, at offshore wind farms, and then recommending targeted research and development activities that would improve the capabilities of those technologies to answer the questions we want to answer, be able to get the type of data that we need to understand effects. So we've been looking at a wide range of technologies for this project, but specifically in relation to biotelemetry, there's a couple of sort of common themes. Regardless of tag type, the use of these technologies often requires managing trade-offs between the precision of fixes, the number of locations, and tag size. And I mentioned this earlier. So developing lighter and higher powered and higher resolution tags continues to be a real priority so that we can understand more about what's going on with a lot of these smaller bodied species. Also, spatial uncertainty in 3 dimensions remains a big thing, particularly that vertical altitude estimation, even for GPS tags, can be really tough. And you can integrate other technology to try to help with that, but then that adds weight, right, again, to the tag. So there's a real need for some further R&D there, I think, as well, both for Modis as well as for other tracking technologies. And as a final note, and I think you probably got this idea from all of the talks so far today, but telemetry is a great way to collect data in relation to offshore wind. It can help answer a wide variety of study questions, but it shouldn't be pursued in isolation. As we've heard today, many technologies can be really complementary. They can provide different types of information at different levels of sort of spatial, temporal, and taxonomic detail. And so for post-construction monitoring in offshore wind farms, if we really want to get a handle on understanding effects, and also for sort of larger regional scale research studies, tagging is a great option, and it should be part of sort of a broader suite of methods that are looking at sort of different scales and have different complementary capabilities. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, and I want to thank all our speakers today, Kate, Rob, and Greg, for presenting a lot of information on different technologies, the scales that can be used, their pros and cons. I think this is all really good information for us as we think about how best to monitor bird and bat movement in the offshore space. Apologies, we're out of time for questions. I know Greg and Rob had answered many of them, and there was a lot of dialogue in the chat. So I think most of those got addressed, but if you have questions for the speakers, I think most gave their email addresses, so you can contact them directly.
I'll put mine in the chat again too. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions, but feel free to email me after this if anyone wants to follow up.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I mean, you all answered a lot of questions in your presentations and in the chat. So thanks again for your time. Thanks everybody for joining, and look for an announcement for an upcoming webinar, SEER webinar, our 4th in the series. Should take place in the August timeframe, but we're still in the organization mode for that one. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good day. Have a good rest of your week.